past, in that its purpose, although Father Richard's introduction has heightened the need that we have for a kind of practical how-to understanding of implementation of Matins. However, this presentation is not going to be directly that. Because I do strongly believe that before one implements, in the case of this service, which has so many features that are different from the rest of the order of liturgical services, one has to have at least some amount of academic, analytical understanding of what it is and what makes it tick. So, what I prepared, and I guess most of you got copies of it. I didn't prepare this directly. It's simply a copy of something I had in my various files of liturgical stuff. What you have here, it doesn't have a title page, as you probably noticed. If you want it to have one, you should just put another page on front that says Matins. Is taken directly from the liturgical service book that is called the Great Horologion, the Great Book of Hours, the book that contains all of the immovable portions of the daily services of the daily cycle. And that's what you have here, together with some commentary. And the commentary has been composed by various people with some knowledge of historical liturgiology. And the comments are you must understand that those bracketed comments, and of course the text begins with one, are not rubrics. The bracketed comments are that. They're comments.
Schofield notes, kind of.
Yeah. This is not a church service book. In fact, although you perhaps will find portions of it useful when you do implement Matins, it's meant to be a workbook, a working text that you can write in, analyze. In fact, it's got typos in it and things that need corrected that are circled and scratched over, and I didn't even attempt to fix those up before having it copied. It's the style of English generally follows the style that is used in the OCA, and also the scriptural portions of the services, with some exception, are taken, and this I regard personally as unfortunate for reasons that I'm not going to fool with here, from the RSV. So that's where the Psalter is from, and the various canticles, for the most part, are taken from the RSV, and I think that has some undesirable features, but that's what's there. But what you do have here is the service of Matins, the immovable portions of it, and that includes, of course, a complete outline as it exists in the Horologion, the Book of Hours, whether it's a Greek one, a Slavonic one, an Arabic one. It all has the same service. There is no difference in what it has. The first question that has to be asked when one approaches this service is, why is it so amazingly complex as compared to the rest of the services of the daily cycle? That has been your experience of it, has it not been? Incomprehensible. The reason why is the purpose for which this service evolved is somewhat different than the rest of the daily services. The rest of the daily services, whether they be the hours or vespers or compline, came into being as those times of the church's common prayer that punctuate the passing of the hours of the day. For the most part, they reflect the kind of need that the church had for something that is, at least to a certain extent, to the point, not too long. The hours, vespers, even vespers when done in its fullness, at least in a community that understands liturgy as a priority, is not that long. Matins came from the experience of the church in general and the monastic life in particular as the vigil of the church, the formulation of the keeping of long hours of prayer and watching by night, ending with the coming of the day. It's not simply a morning prayer service as it has developed. It concludes, one might say, with a morning prayer service, but it is in its essence, and although I've just said that the monastic influence in this service is perhaps the heaviest compared to the rest of the daily offices, one still must not fall into the oversimplification of saying, well, the reason why it's so complicated is that it came from the monks who had nothing to do but have liturgical services. The reason why it is so long and complicated is that it evolved to fill a purpose that needed something long and complicated. Keeping watch by night in prayer, getting up, as many of the early documents say, getting up at cockcrow to watch and to pray, and concluding with the rising of the sun. So the general definition then is Matins is a service of vigil concluding with morning prayer. And we're going to try to, I don't know if I'm going to succeed, but I'm going to try to go through the structure. And if you have this, take it out and use it and follow it along. To go through the structure part by part in an outline form, so that you can see at least partially at this point what's there and a little bit of why it's there, what it's for, what sort of structure is being presented here. So we can say that the service of Matins, as it exists now in the service books of our church, consists of 4 parts. I'd like to say only 3 parts, because the first of the 4 parts is dealt with by this prefatory comment that you see. First part of Matins is called the Royal Beginning or the Imperial Preface, and it consists of its historical purpose. It consists of prayers for the emperor that originally were said only in monastic communities that were of imperial foundation and endowment. Those communities began the round of services each day by attaching on to the beginning of Matins a series of prayers for the emperor. And because many of those monasteries were the large and influential ones, as often happens in liturgical development, something that people got used to doing, especially at a time when the parochial order, the cathedral order of the services was falling more and more into disuse and being replaced by the order that had been developed and formulated in the monasteries. This imperial preface, beginning Matins by praying for the emperor, found its way into all of the recensions of the service books. So the comment that you have here, I'll read it. The Imperial Preface originated in monasteries founded or supported by the emperor in Byzantine times. While it may have been reasonable for such communities to pray for the emperor in a special way, the permanent addition of this material to the church's corporate prayer is highly questionable, especially in an era in which there is no Christian emperor and few Christian governments of any sort. This obviously is an opinionated statement. This is the statement of a bunch of liturgiologists, and therefore it has to be dealt with accordingly. But let's go through the order. I am not right now at the point of even going further on that. Let's go through the order of the imperial preface. You see it begins with the opening blessing, "Blessed is our God, Amen." Then immediately the Trisagion prayers and the Lord's Prayer. After the Lord's Prayer, the "Come, let us worship," or of course Christ is risen in Easter time, and then the chanting of Psalms 19 and 20 according to the Septuagint number. You'll notice in this text, the first number that's not in the parentheses given for Psalms is the Septuagint number. The second number in the parentheses is the Masoretic number. You have Psalms 19 and 20, which even in the Old Testament, in the use of the Psalter in the Old Testament, are prayers for the king. Point out a few verses from Psalm 19. 6th verse down. "Now I know that the Lord will help his anointed." The anointed one is the king. "He will answer him from his holy heaven with mighty victories by his right hand." 3 more verses down. "Give victory to the king, O Lord, answer us when we call." Beginning of Psalm 20. "In thy strength the king rejoices, O Lord, and in thy help how greatly he exalts," etc. These are prayers for the king, and that's why they were put there. Those psalms conclude then with another series of Trisagion prayers. Lord's Prayer, now on page 5. We're going to go quickly. No other way to do it. And followed by the Troparion and Kontakion of the cross, "O Lord, save your people." And as we said the other day, of course, the Troparion and Kontakion of the cross in their historical origin are again prayers for the emperor, "Grant victory to our Orthodox emperor over the barbarians," etc. Guard your commonwealth, prayer for the emperor and his state. And then concluding with a short litany for, again, the ruler, and a couple other petitions are added there. And when that litany concludes, this imperial preface is over. Now, before I go on, what I would suggest you do when you have some time to do this, to study on your own, is that you take whatever books in your own libraries you have handy that have an outline for Matins in those books, whether it be the Antiochian Service Book, whether it be Hatgood, whether it be, I don't know what, Byzantine Daily Worship, the New Skeet Service Book, whatever you have in your collection. And because none of those books publish Matins in its fullness, because those books weren't intended to do that. Those books were intended to reflect kind of the highlights from the order of Matins that were common in the parochial usages that those books were made to serve. And greatest hits of Matins, as it's often called. And if you want to, as a good exercise, take those books and then take your outline of the complete service here and label in your service books which part, whatever appears in the service books, is actually coming from in the complete order. And then you'll see what bits and pieces have survived, and then perhaps you can, if you wish, play amateur liturgiologist and ask yourself why this bit has been put in here and why not another bit. But there's some profit to be found in doing that. Now we'll go on to the second portion, beginning where this page where it says Matins in big bold letters on the top. Matins. Part 1, Nocturns. Nocturns is a synonymous word for vigil, the daily vigil. If you want to give a definition for that, you can call it that, the daily vigil. And the term vigil, as it is, as it's used to describe a liturgical service, can mean one of two things. It's important to know that. Vigil is used generally to describe a service that consists of the entirety of Vespers, followed by the entirety of Matins as a most of the night or all night observance, particularly before the Lord's Day or a great feast. That's called a vigil. And it exists in all traditions, by the way. Sometimes people say these days that only in the Russian church do you have vigils, Vespers, followed by Mass. That's not true. As you'll see, even in the new Antiochian Liturgicon that's coming out, the rubrics for vigil are going to be included in there. So vigil means that on the one hand. Vigil also means, more specifically as a liturgical term, the first part of, or as since we're counting the imperial beginning, the first part, the second part of the service of Matins, although it says part 1 even there. So, well, I'll tell you what. Let's say for the sake of liturgiology, that Matins is divided into 3 parts plus a preface. Okay, and we'll say that part 1, Nocturns or vigil, is part 1, the first part of the service. This portion, by its very title, Nocturne meaning night watch, or vigil meaning the same thing, a watch, is intended to be exactly that. It is the means by which the practice of the early church in one way or other, and you can find all kinds of records of this in history, both in the monasteries and in the parochial usages, the practice of the church to assemble very early in the morning, most often before it's even gotten light, especially in a society where the coming and going of light are the 2 great pivots of the day, to assemble for prayer and to spend a good long time doing it, to come together to keep watch by night. That's what this first portion of Matins is, the crystallization of that. So it begins with a blessing, and this blessing is unique from the rest of the usual blessed is our God or blessed is the kingdom. Matins begins with the Trinitarian blessing, glory to the holy, consubstantial, life-creating, and undivided Trinity. I cannot tell you why, but this unique blessing has been reserved for the beginning of Matins. And then immediately the response, Amen, and then the exclamation repeated 3 times, glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill toward men, and O Lord, open my lips and my mouth shall declare your praise. We pray that before the liturgy too, but that prayer at the beginning of the daily round, although of course we do say that the day begins with Vespers the night before, yet still the coming early in the morning and waking up after sleep, the prayer for the opening of the lips so that the mouth can proclaim the praises of the Lord. And then immediately comes that unit that is called the 6 Psalms. They are 6 immovable psalms, which in the full order are meant to be done every day. Of course, whether or not, again, we're not talking about a practical order right now for a 20-minute morning prayer service. We can talk about that, and it's an important thing to talk about. But we're talking about the full order. These 6 immovable psalms, which you see on here, 337, 62, 87, 102, and 142, are all in one way or other psalms of vigil. I'll point out a couple verses to that effect. In the first one, Psalm 3, I lie down and sleep, I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. Psalm 62, O God, you are my God, I seek you. Actually, the Septuagint says literally, O God, you are my God, for you I watch, or for you I keep vigil. My soul thirsts for you. I will meditate on you through the watches of the night, for you are my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will rejoice. Psalm 87, Lord my God, I call for help by day, I cry out in the night before you. You can see why these were chosen, because the church has assembled literally before dawn to cry out in the night. The last one, Psalm 142, let me hear of your love in the morning, for example. These are all chosen as these psalms are chosen to be prayers of vigil. So these 6 psalms, which are mentioned as a unit as early as the 4th century in some places, have their place there at the beginning of the Nocturne. They are followed by, page 10 we're on, the Great Litany, Now, the service of Matins, just as the service of Vespers, has a number of prayers. And you know from the Vespers that the prayers of light in due course in liturgical history, when prayers became more and more unheard by the people and were said silently by the priest, the prayers of light became pushed all together and were said, for example, at Vespers by the priest quietly while Psalm 104 was being sung. Likewise, Matins has 12 prayers, which in the contemporary service books are all printed in one place, and it's assumed that the priest is going to come out and say them during the chanting of the 6 Psalms. But this order has them as an appendix, all 12 of them together, and also returns them to the places for which they were originally intended when they were said aloud. So at the conclusion of the Great Litany, on page 11, you see Matins prayer 1, again a prayer of rising for sleep. We thank you, Lord our God, who have raised us from our beds and put into our mouths a word of praise, etc. Then, after that Great Litany comes what might be called an acclamation. And there are 3 of them. You notice on page 12, actually the one that's given first there is the one that's used the least at Matins for the departed, which is done a few times during the year, primarily on the Memorial Saturdays. But it's a response with Alleluia as the refrain. If you look on page 14, you'll see an acclamation, again with Alleluia as the refrain. This is meant for the weekdays of Lent, and the verses, "In the night my soul rises early for you, O God, for your commandments are a light upon the earth." And the people sing Alleluia as the refrain to that. Then on page 16, you will see the normal response, the response that those of you who have some experience with Matins are most familiar with, the response that is prescribed for all ordinary days. God is the Lord and has revealed himself to us, or I would certainly prefer the more literal translation, God is the Lord who has given us light, or who has shown us the light, which is the common one actually sung in our archdiocese. And again, it's an acclamation of the coming of the new day. God is the true light, and you have psalm verses there. Following that acclamation, you have, no matter what the acclamation may be, whether it's an ordinary day or a Lenten weekday or a Memorial Saturday, you have the troparion of the day. And then you see on the bottom of page 17, Little Litany, and at the top of page 18, another prayer. You have these units of psalmody, hymnography, and prayer. Psalmody, hymnography, and prayer. You know that most of the other services are constructed that way. So is Matins. The reason why Matins appears complex is that there are so many units. Lots of units, not just 1 or 2. There are several in the course of the whole service. Then, in the order then, after those 6 psalms and Great Litany and prayer and acclamation, comes the chanting of the prescribed variable portion of the Psalter for the day. And perhaps you know that according to the full order, which is only observed in monasteries these days, it's intended in the tradition that the Psalter is chanted through once a week. And it's divided up into 20 parts. Each one of those 20 parts is called a Kathisma, Kathisma. The 20 Kathismata in the plural equals 1 Psalter. Psalter broken up into 20 parts. If you have any one of those standard service books, the Festal Manean or a number of others, you can see in the introduction which psalms belong in which Kathisma. So, and furthermore, each Kathisma, each 1/20th of the Psalter, is broken up into 3 parts, each one of which is called a Stases. A Kathisma comes from the Greek word meaning to sit, indicating probably that during the chanting of the Psalter, people did sit down. Probably, or in their stalls, in a monastery, in their chairs. because what's intended here, and the reason why this is a vigil service, what's intended to go on here, is going to be 2 or 3 of these Kathismata. That means 2 or 3/20ths of the 150 Psalms. That is a lot of Psalms. If you've ever, probably not many of you, unless you, I don't know what, visited the Holy Mountain or gone to one of the monastic communities here, have even seen Matins done in its fullness. It's a long service. It is a daily vigil. To do the whole service every day in its fullness, at least 2.5 hours, sometimes longer. So, in your average monastic community, either the bell rings or the semantron is bonged about 3 o'clock in the morning, and they get up and they go to church and they finish after dawn sometime. That's the daily rule. If you think that's sort of exclusively monastic, though, historically speaking, it wasn't so. I'm not saying that we can necessarily do what was done in the early centuries of the church, but what was done in the early centuries of the church was done in both the parish churches and in the monasteries. So you have these big chunks of Psalter, and following those chunks of Psalter, that takes care of this first portion of the Matin service, the portion that's the daily vigil, the daily nocturn, the daily watch, consisting mostly of psalmody with some prayer. And then, if you look on page 20, we come to the second part, which we'll call the name there festal nocturns, or it also could be called festal or Sunday nocturns.
Before you go on, this word polyel,
we're just coming to it.
Oh, okay, it's on page 19.
Right, but it's on page 20. What it is on page 20.
Okay.
Festal or Sunday nocturns or vigil is an insert that comes into the full order of the service on a Sunday or a great feast. So it's not necessarily something that's done every day. It's something that's done as part of a great Matins on Sunday or a feast day, and it's done in addition to what's come before. It doesn't replace what's come before. It's done in addition to it. And it begins with some special psalmody. Psalms 134 and 135, which are called the polyaleon or the polyaleos, sometimes ending with S instead of N. Polyaleon means many mercies or much mercy in the singular, and it's taken from, the refrain of Psalm 135, which is the one that every verse ends with, "For his mercy endures forever." So they're called the Psalms of many mercies even in the temple worship of the Old Testament. These are the Psalms that were called the Great Hallel, the Great Alleluia Psalms. These are the Psalms that were sung at the Passover supper, when it says in the Gospel that after they had sung the hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives. It's the Great Hallel that ended the eating of the Seder. And this is what they sang. And these two Psalms, 134 and 135, these have passed into the liturgical tradition of the church as being special Psalms for the great days, whether it be every Sunday or for the great feasts. Churches have their variations with their use, but they're always they're never simply chanted. They're always sung very solemnly. They do all kinds of things during them because the Greek words polyaleos, much mercy, can also mean much oil. During this portion of the service, historically, is when they used to illuminate the church very brightly and light all the lamps and pass out candles to the people. And if you were in dramatic Russia before the days of gas or electricity, they would wire the great chandeliers with wicks coated with gunpowder, so the whole thing would go at the beginning of the polyaleos. If you go to this day to a vigil for a big feast day on Mount Athos or other monasteries, especially if it's a big monastery with a lot of monks, during this they'll light all the lamps up and they'll start swinging them around even. Maybe you've heard some people describe that have been there. It's kind of festal explosion for days that call for a festal explosion. So you have these two psalms. And then I'll only mention it in passing on page 24, the bottom there. There is added to those two psalms, and Father Alexander explains it very well on the Sundays immediately before Great Lent as a particular liturgical feature leading us up to Great Lent. The singing of at the Matins of those Sundays, the Song of Exile by the Waters of Babylon, which is printed there on the bottom of page 24. Following that psalmody, that festal psalmody, you have a unit of hymnography. The Lord, teach me your statutes. This tends to be for the Sunday Matins one of the greatest hits that everybody does, even if they leave out 95% of the service. They do this. So there's some hymnography, and page 28 again, prayer. You'll notice in the rubrics that are provided here, also at various points in the order, there's a notation made that there is an instructional reading, and this comes from a time when during these vigils everybody would sit down and they would read from the sermons of the fathers at various times. It keeps another thing to do if you're keeping vigil through most of the night. So where you see / instructional reading, you won't necessarily, these weren't necessarily prescribed passages either. They would just sometimes take the homilies on whatever the gospel of the day that was going to be that they could find and read them. I've seen that done once. There's some more, another little piece of hymnography called the Hymn of Degrees or the Song of Ascent, page 29. Because I wish, in fact, I'd recommend that you cross out that. You see where it says the Hymn of Degrees and replace it with something that's much more direct, the Song of Ascent, because it was meant to accompany an act of ascent. This is because the climax of this portion of Matins on Sunday or feast day that's being led up to is going to be the reading of the gospel. Whether it's the resurrection gospel on Sunday or the festal gospel at a great feast. And the Song of Ascent was meant to be sung as the deacon was going to ascend into the sanctuary to get the gospel, to bring it out to be read. And then immediately following that, on page 30, the introduction, the prokimenon before the gospel, and the introduction to the gospel, continuing on to page 31, and the reading of the festal gospel, or the Sunday resurrection gospel. And then on page 32, the resurrection gospel, as it says there, on Sundays, on Lazarus Saturday, daily in Easter time, on Ascension Day, on the elevation of the cross, there is this hymn, Having Beheld the Resurrection of Christ, that is taken from the Paschal service. And it's particularly its use on Sunday as a response to the proclamation of the resurrection gospel. You have there the weekly acclamation of the Paschal celebration, the fact that every Sunday is a little Pascha, every Sunday is Pascha. So this portion from the Paschal service as an acclamation to the resurrection gospel is used there. It's only done on Sundays, as you see, or days that are connected with the resurrection, even if they're not Sundays, like Lazarus Saturday or Exaltation of the Cross, etc. Not done for feast days in general.
Oh, David. Where's the gospel read from, the Matins gospel?
Well, it's read from various places, according to various customs. The reading of the Sunday gospel of the resurrection, the rubric that governed that, comes from a practice from the Church of Jerusalem, where this kind of crystallization of the Sunday services as the weekly Paschal celebration and the Sunday Vespers and Matins as being the weekly Easter vigil was done in the environment of the holy places. And in fact, you can read, if you have, I've mentioned it a lot of times before, if you have the book Aegarius Travels, you can read how even in the 4th century they were basically doing, not in as crystallized a form, but they were basically doing everything that we've described here. And this is not in a monastery. But the feature of that would be the patriarch would go into the tomb, and he would read the weekly resurrection gospel at the tomb. So what happened, as of course this service was done everywhere in the Christian world, everywhere in the Orthodox world, the first practice was that, and you'll still see this in churches of the Slavic tradition. It's the only time where the priest will stand at the altar, facing the altar, and not facing the people, and read the gospel. This is simply an inheritance from what everybody who went on pilgrimage saw in Jerusalem, with the patriarch going into the tomb and reading the resurrection gospel at the tomb. It was kind of fleshing that out in your local church. Then, later on, in churches of the Greek tradition, there was added a little extra dramatic feature. And that is that since the myrrh-bearing women and the apostles, in many of the resurrection narratives, hear the angel who appear to them announcing the glad tidings of the resurrection at the side, of the tomb, that there came this practice of the priest going to the side of the altar, as I'm sure you've seen in your local Antiochian churches, to read the resurrection gospel. He's kind of acting out the angel's part there. It's one of those little features that come from the dramatic strata of liturgical development. And then that is the Sunday resurrection gospel only, however. The gospel for a feast day matins in all Orthodox traditions, according to the rubrics, is to be read in the middle of the church. If sometimes you see the priest going to the right side of the altar at a festal matins to do that, it's because he doesn't know his rubrics so well. But on a great feast, the priest is supposed to come out into the middle of the church, stand in the midst of the people. There's, supposed to be a stand there like we've had in many of our churches. And he's supposed to proclaim the festal matins gospel there in the midst of the people.
Facing the altar?
Yeah, standing in the midst of the people. Now, whether or not that has to be done literally, whether that has to be the exact spot where it's read is another question. That's what is called for the feast days. I never did it that way myself. I always read it facing the people. I always read the Sunday resurrection gospel also facing the people. I didn't see what purpose that particular dramatic little touch had these days. But that's.
I will say, upon visits to various Antiochian churches, the place to read it is at the right side of the altar.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've ever been in an Antiochian church on feast day. I don't know whether that's done or not.
Well, the thing, because so many of the parishes now, for their feast days, are having a vesperal liturgy, and the matins on the big feast days isn't often done so much. You might have to search before you find it.
I think some of them just read it from the wall door.
Yeah, sometimes they do that. Yeah, that's basically what I do. I mean, if I had a big cathedral with one of those huge openings in the middle of the church, I might do something like that. I've so far in my life little churches where to go out in the middle of the people, you're there anyway, practically.
All three of you.
Is it customary in the Antioch jurisdiction to have a matins every Sunday morning prior to the liturgy?
Mm-hmm. Or greatest hits thereof. Usually greatest hits thereof. Yeah. In fact, I would say that that's what everybody does. That's what goes on in the OCA churches. If they have matins, it's greatest hits of matins, a la Slavic style. And in the Greek churches, it's greatest hits of Matins a la Greek style.
Let me ask you another question then. Because I don't think I'm really catching the picture or something. We ring the bell at 10 o'clock for the liturgy. People show up at 5 o'clock. If I could only imagine at 9 o'clock, there's going to be me and the deacon. Why do it?
So 9:30 is what we do.
Huh?
They will come.
They will come.
I'll guarantee
The ones that want to
they
pray will come.
People are flocking to it. It started with just a few, and now you can't keep people away from it.
And they love the kiss that
Wait
coffee.
a minute. Now, let's be realistic. Now, I'm just asking questions, okay? People flock to the hours, but now the hours are not being done. I mean, how long will that last? I'm very reluctant to start something that can't be done 10 years from now.
Well, the Metropolitan wants it done.
I know he does. But I'm asking you, I'd like to have a little bit, I know he wants it, but people want other things now. It's a fact. But I don't want to do something just, what, I had two or three priests tell me, and I don't understand this. I'm sure there's reasoning for it. Just somebody please explain it to me logically so I can understand it. I've had priests tell me, well, we hold it whether there's anybody in there or not, but just me and the deacon.
Because you're there to pray.
Well, why? I mean, that seems like an enormous amount of energy, money, time, 5,000 other things. I mean, you don't have to do it right there to pray, do you?
It depends. It depends. If it's depends on what kind of day it is. If it's a feast day of the church, I'm going to be there. I don't care who else is there. If they're there, fine. If they're not, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, the church is present.
This is the end of side 1. Please turn the tape over now.